Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about life through the prism of food. And this week we're off to Seoul with British-Korean writer Sue Scott.
I often think that art and beauty cannot be created without some difficulties. It's often the adversities that brings the most beautiful outcome or gives you the lens to see something in it.
Sue has lived in Britain longer than she ever lived in Korea, where she grew up, and has raised her own daughter in London. But her latest book, Pocha, tells the story of the country she left behind, her family and the food they shared, often in the pochas, the covered markets and the food stalls, which are about so much more than food. I asked her how writing the book helped to bring those memories back to her and to pass them on to her daughter.
I think I wasn't so sure of who I was. So it was quite interesting because we were kind of experiencing things in the same way, but also very different because I have background knowledge in, what this is all about, whereas it was totally new to her. So it was really interesting experience for both of us.
Well, tell us a little bit about who you are. You talk about your relationship with Pocha over the years and what it means to you and how you're bringing it home, wherever home is, and to all your readers' homes. Tell us about how you grew up.
So I grew up in Korea in a very ordinary family during the time when Korea was going through quite a big economic shift, I think.
So the 90s. 80s and 90s.
Yeah, well, I was born in 80s and 90s. I think it was time of change. Korea was just kind of opening to, for free travel. And there was Olympics. It was, a lot was happening and a lot was changing. My father, who kind of worked all over Seoul, he was very passionate about good food, partly because I think he came from the era where the food was quite precious. And he was really passionate about good food, not necessarily expensive food, but just hunting down the good food from all these hidden places in the markets. And I just remember him just taking us to these places, and it was just magical. And I guess my relationship with Pocha is, I think it's nostalgia. And because I left home at the age of 19, I think I still kind of have this really romantic relationship with those markets. And it ultimately brings all the memories of childhood. And I think in some ways I'm quite desperate to keep that going because that's the only part of Korea that I know.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So let's just break that down. So Pocha is, well, you say that there are 3 different stories about what Pocha actually is, but let's go for the horse and cart, the covered tarpaulin, which is what it actually means. And this is where people would stop on the road and have a little drink and a little snack. And then, of course, your Pocha was probably the more kind of the covered markets that we possibly have seen throughout different parts of Asia, where everybody's having a bowl of noodles, but it's all about the chat and it's about the buzz and it's about the beautiful smells. We might know them as the kind of night markets and the Padang in Malaysia, for example. How particular and how specific are the Pocha in Korea compared to the night markets that we know across Asia?
I mean, I guess there's a lot of similarities because these, in a nutshell, it's a place outside and where people can just gather and eat and enjoy drinks and just all of those things. But to me, Pocha, I felt, and it's particularly because I think I understood why my father really wanted us to experience these cultures. It boomed around the time when Korea was growing economically, and it was all these people who came to Seoul with the dreams of becoming somebody. And those people gathered in these Pocha joints and after work. And it's the place where they just kind of offloaded the labour of life.
Yeah, I love the way that you talk about it as therapeutic. It is about... in fact, I'm interviewing Fuchsia Dunlop tomorrow about her beautiful book about Invitation to a Banquet. And she talks a lot about the role of food as health, but as an integral part of culture as well. And that's what I felt when you were talking about the kind of the buzz and the feeling of sitting around and chatting offloading the therapeutic value of that. I think you even use the word therapeutic, don't you?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's a place where, Korea, I think, because it went through such a change and people have this resilient nature, but also they have a lot they carry with them. And I think these pocha joints, where it was a place where everybody were treated equally and they could just talk about anything and offload. And there's always aunties and uncles who serves this food. They will listen to you and you befriend with them. And I just love this psychological effect the food has and how the food can bring people together. And I guess I'm always interested in people's story, because dish is the dish, but there's always a story to every single dish, and even the same dish carries a slightly different meaning for everyone. And I just love that.
I love it too, and I love the idea that it's the pocha refers to the tarpaulin, doesn't it? So there's a sense of everybody huddling together in a tent, and I fantasize about the kind of the rain coming down. In fact, one of my daughter, when we took her to Sri Lanka, we were sitting in a cafe. She was about 16 or something, and we were sitting under a tin roof. And the rain in Asia is extraordinary, isn't it? I grew up in Penang, so I really remember the downpour, and she experienced it, and the sound of the rain on the tin roof, and she said, "Isn't it beautifully calm here?" And I went, yes, it really is, because it is the cacophony that actually is incredibly calming. And I wonder what that is. Put that into your prism of the therapeutic pocha. How does that work? Is it just because everybody's just together and it's a celebration of humanity?
I think it's because it's so real. It's so real, and it's kind of very unfussy, unadorned version of restaurant in a way. And you're outside and there's this environment, but you create an environment. You are part of the environment. And I think that's what's so special, because you can't create that with force. It just happens very naturally. And there's the eavesdropping. It's just going really right down the basics of human needs and our nature.
Yeah. You use a lot of, food memories, but they pop memories. And you write about the slowly rotating fans and the mosquito strips hanging precariously from the roof in summer brings me the happiness of balmy evenings. You talk about cooling August showers that made my feet squelch, but a bowl of plain and simple udon noodles slurped under the rain was always perfectly cosy and tasty. It just brings it all together. I was absolutely there with you in a place that I literally don't know. And you use that kind of writing to describe a place that probably most of us will never go to. But I wonder if the career that we would find now, we would ever be able to find that pocha, that memory that you create there.
I think you could if you hunt down. I think if you avoid those main strips where it's mostly known to tourists, and if you kind of slightly go away from those beaten tracks, I think you could, because Korea is one of those countries, they do evolve and they constantly change, but they're very passionate about preserving their own cultures and history. We are the nation that went through such a turbulent times, and I think we know the value of, holding down that traditional culture. So I think you could.
Yeah, the Korean Book of Happiness. Do you know this one?
I've heard about it. I haven't read it.
So I didn't put it on the show in the end, just because it didn't really fit with the format of the show. But there was something in it that's really stayed with me, and it is about a code to happiness. Well, and it is about the grit and resilience and the happiness that comes from that. It's almost like you can't have happiness unless you've been through the pain.
I totally agree.
And because Koreans have, and even, people of your generation who didn't actually experience a lot of the grit, you will have had it in your DNA, and you would have had it certainly in the stories from your aunts and your and uncles and your grandparents. And of course, I mean, you know, recent poverty and recent war, obviously. I mean, do you feel that's a kind of a prevailing feeling in Korea even today, that there's the ghosts of the past?
What's interesting is the younger generations who obviously haven't lived that kind of Korea, they seem to be quite interested in history and the past and wanted to find the truth. And of course, I think we went through the times where some history was distorted and it wasn't always openly discussed, or some part just pure and simple, just disregarded. And I think this new generations of more savvy and more intelligent, I think, more connected and more clued up people, just really looking into this history. And I think maybe that gives them the sense of what our ancestors had gone through. I often think the art and beauty cannot be created without some difficulties. It's often the adversities that brings the most beautiful outcome, or gives you the lens to see something in it. Whereas I think, you know, when you're always happy and jolly good, I think it's quite hard to remember those small things.
Yeah, and you say that actually you use Pocha as an analogy for Korea. You know, it's about tradition and modernism coexisting very much. You talk about when you went back a couple of years ago, when your daughter was then 7.5, and the music in the streets is all K-pop. So you've got these kind of Pocha which have been modernised because the government was very clear about what they wanted Seoul to look like for the Olympics. So they cleaned out a lot of the Pochas, which is why those tarpaulin ones are so hard to find now. But the music is all about what Korea means to the rest of the world. How does that feel when you go back? Because that's not your career at all, is it?
Yeah, because I think I left when the K-pop was kind of just starting to find its way. And it's interesting. I always say I left home when it wasn't so great in so many senses, so many ways. And then now I go back, it's like, oh my goodness, this is a whole different world. I don't know this world. But even within that, I think the beauty of Korean culture and nature is they are very, very good at just keeping in touch with the past. And I think it's so beautiful.
How do they do that? Because again, that comes from the Korean Book of Happiness, the ability to really understand nature, to really know where you've come from is the key to experiencing happiness in the present. What do you see in terms of that celebration of the history and the past? What's the physical manifestation of that? What do you see?
I feel as though the Korean people and Korea themselves, they perhaps feel the need to make a statement of who we are in so many ways that it's a bit like you never realise who you are until it's taken away from you. And maybe that's why people always trying to remember where they come from and who they are, and try not to forget how we became the nation that we are.
It's a subject that we explore a lot on this programme, because a lot of people who come on this show are talking about exactly that. The homeland they left behind, and how they feel about who they are through writing themselves real through their food books and their cookbooks. Very often they come here for university and they stay, and then they feel a kind of an ache and a sense of longing for something. They don't know what it is, and they ring their mums and their grandmothers and they start cooking the food from home, and then they start feeding other people, and it's like, oh, this is who I am. I mean, is that your journey through your food?
Completely. I don't think I was even interested in necessarily cooking Korean food until my daughter was born. I was so desperate to leave home ever since I was young. I don't know why. I just dreamt about this faraway place that is more beautiful, that is more, rainbow coloured. I never was really interested in staying in Korea. But for whatever the reason, I came here to study. And then, I really wanted to immerse in the culture. I wanted to be accepted as one of you, I guess, and spend loads of time trying to integrate into the culture without realizing actually what I'm losing. And I think the earlier sort of decade being in London, I just really deliberately not kept in touch with my Korean culture at all, because I felt like it was a mission for me to feel like part of, I wanted to feel like I was a Londoner. I loved this city, and I wanted to respect, in a way, I think learning the language of the country that you're living and understanding the nitty-gritty, the small things that, really learning the small details. I think in a way it's kind of like respecting the culture, respecting the city where you're in. And I did that for a decade. And then another decade, I probably lived just trying to, make my home here. Then my daughter was born. I think that was a real shift for me, because I was terribly depressed after amazing birth. Just suddenly, the sheer responsibility that I'm supposed to give this culture to this newborn who didn't ask me to be born, but I brought her out here. And I just felt like there was enormous amount of responsibility laid on my shoulder, because my husband's British and he's going to inevitably try to give his culture to her. And we live here, so she's going to naturally pick up Britishness. And I just felt like, I need to do this, but how am I going to do this? I can only do this through food. And I think...
Did you think that immediately?
No, I didn't. I was struggling. I didn't know what to do. And I was trying to remember. I think the first thing that I did was, what makes me Korean? I asked myself that very question. It was brutal. It was a very cruel time. I think I went through some dark days of soul searching. But one of those things that I immediately remembered was the smell in my mother's kitchen. And I think for me, because I've always loved those, I'm quite an emotional person, and I seem to go to the places. When I go to the memories, it's not always just one small thing. It's about smells and textures. I see the colours and, all the small details. Emotion. Very, very... And it was so powerful. And I think the very first smell that I had was two things. One was a kimchi stew, and the other one was a bone broth, which my mother always made in winter. And the smell of bone broth, I don't know whether you've ever boiled the bones before, but it
I do every week.
Oh, do you? It's quite strong. Sometimes, especially, I think...
Well, I do chicken bones, so actually that's not...
That's the lovely smell. But it was this really powerful smell of those two dishes that are so... It was my mum's kitchen, and it was like, that's it. I want to remember this.
Did it make you feel better, Sue?
It took me a long time. I think for a very long time, I felt very sad. I felt like I had cut an invisible cord that was attached to me from homeland. I felt like last 2 decades, I have deliberately, or maybe a decade, I had deliberately cut that out. So I felt really sad. Until, I guess, when I starting to feel the joy of those dishes and more memories starting to come to me. And I realised this is the most tangible thing that I could do in order to pass on my culture to my daughter. And I come to terms with the fact that it's okay for me to be sitting somewhere in the middle, carrying these two cultures. Because actually, I grew up in London, in a way. My adult life is in London.
Yeah. And do you think that that's why you wrote those books? The Rice Table first and now this one. Did you have a sense that you wanted to write it all down for her?
Rice Table was definitely for her, because I felt I was so terribly scared of memories fading, because it was at the time where I kind of felt like I have nowhere else to go. I need to find who I am. I felt that responsibility, and it was my mission to get there. I didn't know how, but it was food. And it was so... The feeling that I had to write this down, regardless, whatever happens, it was so powerful. That was definitely for Kiki. Pocha, I think, again, it's always... I mean, you cannot detach her, can you? I kind of feel like I'm now in this really interesting relationship with me and my career and my daughter and her career. And I guess a story will never leave her out because we are growing together, walking through this journey of discovering. In a way, I think my careerness was reborn after a birth of my daughter. You're born again kind of thing. I really feel that.
Yeah, I do too. I think it's an enormous experience that very few people talk about. A few people have said pretty much the same thing on this show, actually. I think it's a really, really powerful thing. And I think that's why you get a lot of women writing about food, actually. They want to say something that's very profound, and a lot of it is wrapped up in food memories and nostalgia about something they haven't been able to say before, and somehow food helps them pop those memories. Let's go through some of your food moments. The northern style kimchi dumpling, it belongs to your family. You're talking about your late paternal grandfather from North Korea.
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of people that you talk about food with, they often talk about the family recipes, and I actually didn't have many of those family recipes because I don't remember. I haven't learned from my maternal mother or grandmother, but it was through the observations that naturally happened. And when I was thinking about all these recipes, it was more of the memories and trying to recreate those flavours. But this particular recipe, it's so my family. And it was so easy for me to remember because my father, who insisted on making this every occasions, whenever there was a big national holiday or celebration, we all had together in this production line. My mother made a big batch of filling and we were making it. And it's one of the first dishes that I felt that I wanted to make it a tradition in my home in London, because I needed something that Kiki can remember it as her Korean tradition. And we started making them. And it was just such a beautiful moment. My daughter, my daughter especially, she likes the tactile things. She's very much into making things. And dumpling is just such a beautiful way of getting into food. And she was making this, and she's quite fussy with food and she doesn't like anything mixed. I thought she was not going to like the taste of it, but she absolutely loved it and she often requested it. Honestly, the first time she requested that we make these dumplings again, I cried. I was so, because it felt like this is how powerful the food can be. And I think she often remembers the stories of, we were all sitting down plating these dumplings and mine was always really neat and my sisters were slightly more decorative and, all of these small details. And I think it's just so beautiful. I just absolutely love it. Yeah,
and you sent a video of Kiki making her first dumpling to your father. How absolutely lovely. Your second one is the zambap and dojang vegetables. Is that how you pronounce them?
Yes. Yes.
Come on, why this one?
So I guess because my Korean food is always very nostalgic and is, in a way, I think it's always roots back to the very traditional flavours, because I grew up in 80s when, 80s and 90s, the food in Korea was still very much traditional with a slight influence of Western cuisine, but not as it is now. I mean, now you get everything when you go to Korea. But for me, I always felt, because Korean food in London, especially in UK, especially in the last few years, has been slowly on the up and rising. People are very interested. But those kind of trend and a particular rise of popularity in a cuisine can, I think, sometimes have an adverse effect in limiting the broader ranges of food that can be discovered. And this particular dish, stew doesn't really fit it, but I think that was the best description that I could give. It's a very home-style dish, often made at the times when you feel really tired or lethargic or, maybe don't have much appetite. It can be winter, it can be summer. And it's very, very thickened vegetable stew made with a very traditional Korean fermented bean paste, doenjang. You either eat it hot or cold, and you wrap them in this beautiful seasonal pliable vegetables to make a little parcels. And it's something that you wouldn't necessarily discover unless you know someone who has told you about this, or you go off the completely beaten track. And I think some of these dishes, for me personally, is more rounder view of Korean food, and it definitely deserves the spotlight. So in a way, I feel the responsibility to, shine the light on these lesser known dishes that can be really delicious.
And of course, you talk about it being home style, but these are pocha food as well. This is the kind of food you find in pocha. Yeah. And your third food moment is actually the first Korean street snack your daughter tried when she was 2, on that first visit we were talking about before. And it's the fish-shaped peanut butter and jam pastry. Great for a little 2-year-old.
Well, actually, the version that she tried was with the traditional version with the sweetened red bean paste. Because red bean paste is used in a lot of sweet things, pastries in across Asia, I think. But it was interesting. When she first tried it, she loved it. I don't think she was keen on the red filling itself, but she loved that sort of soft kind of pancake-like batter that was slightly crispy on the outside. And I found it so fascinating because she, obviously as 2-year-old girl, found that similarities in her taste, that, this tastes a bit like a pancake, and she loved it. A few years later, I came home and then we decided we were going to try to make them. I ordered those fish mould thing from online. And as I was making it, I suddenly remembered the time that when my father and I used to make this peanut butter jelly toasted sandwich. My father was, one of those things that he used to do for us is he used to take us to huge Costco when it first came to Korea. And he would be so interested in these foreign things, because it's exciting. And I think, in a way, a lot of my food interest stems from those experiences that my father had exposed me to. And one of the things that he bought was this toasted sandwich maker. We would make this peanut butter jelly sandwich, and it was so new and so exciting. I got so excited about snapping those beautifully indented triangles. And as I was making this fish-shaped thing, I don't know why. I think it's because perhaps it was a tool that I'm using. It brought me straight back to those kitchens where I sat on the floor or at the table making these things with my father. There was a smell of peanut butter and slightly burnt toast and just happiness. It was often Sunday afternoon. We were just extremely happy and relaxed and doing these things. And I wondered, and I had this conversation with my daughter, which is why I made a peanut butter jelly filling in there. I said, well, these are the memories that I had with my father. I don't know whether you will remember these when you are older, but I hope, you do remember that our love was always in the kitchen.
Oh, absolutely lovely. And your final food moment is Chuncheon style spicy stir-fried chicken. And this is about going back to the same restaurant every time you go to Korea and eating the same dish. And I presume this pocha that you go to is a modern pocha, one of the kind of the post-90s, post-Olympics pochas, the air-conditioned sort of environment. So this is the coexisting of the old traditions and the modernism we talked about before. Tell us why you chose this one.
Chuncheon is actually a place, and there's this particular dish that has come from that area. It's very regional. And that dish obviously had travelled to Seoul and everywhere else, and there's lots of places selling that spicy chicken stir-fry. And whenever we go to Seoul, we go to this particular place, and it's now bricks and mortar restaurant, but it sells this really just quite street foodie-like dish. We always order the same thing. This is often the first and last meal that we have. I think it's partly because we feel so comforted by it, but also it feels like it's us telling us, it's a way of acclimatizing ourselves either into Seoul or into London. And we order exactly the same thing, and you eat this beautifully stir-fried spicy chicken with lots of vegetables. But I make sure that everybody leaves just enough bits and pieces in the pan. Everything happens in front of you and you do it yourself. So it's it's exciting. It's very theatrical. And then we order a rice at the end to fry them with all the bits and pieces, because I think Koreans really wants to fry rice at the end of every saucy meal that you have. I mean, maybe it's because there's no meal complete without rice. I think my father used to say Koreans live with the power of the rice, the rice is life. So we then stir fry this thing and we leave it to kind of scorch at the bottom slightly and wait patiently. And then, there's a smell while you're waiting. And it's kind of the moment of joy and the moment of real Korean culture that I feel that I can pass it on to my daughter, because you would know unless, you've heard about it or you've experienced it. And then we just get, hands in, spoons in and elbows and just digging in. And it's just so much fun. And for me, it's so real. And it's just one of the best way to experience what it's all about.
And how does it feel now, Sue? I mean, obviously, she's 9 now, and it won't be for a while until you can really sort of see who she's going to be in the world. But what about you? That feeling of sadness that you had when she was first born, and that feeling of responsibility, I mean, has that lifted because of these books and this journey, this enormous journey that you've been on?
Yeah, completely. It's interesting. I often say about the growth and the journey that I have walked since the birth of my daughter, and also more significantly since these 2 books. I wrote 2 books quite close together, partly because I think I've always known that this is the journey that I wanted to take. When I pitched my first book, it was always going to be part of 3 that I have mentioned to my publishers. I guess writing a book is quite a lonely journey sometimes, isn't it? Especially cookbooks, I think it's interesting. But the genre of cookbook that I'm writing especially, there's a lot of my personal stories, there's a lot of feelings, there's a lot of emotions. And what that does, I feel, is it gives you a chance to process everything, black and white on paper. It's very cathartic. It's been a cathartic experience for me. It's almost like a release of all the tension and all the kind of anger, and maybe sometimes I was able to let that go and release it, and learning to accept the truth, like where I am is okay.
It feels like you're living this Korean guide to happiness, the grit, the sadness, the depression, the weight of the responsibility, the resilience, getting through it, making a plan, getting on and writing the books and coming out with a new sense of self.
Maybe it is. In a way, maybe that is my Koreanness coming out naturally. Maybe that's what I inherited as Korean, just being able to use the difficulties as a tool to overcome and create something beautiful.
Thanks for listening. Do head over to my Substack for extra bites of Sue's story through Korea. And I'll see you next week.